we will kick off here. With us for this session, we have a whole team actually from the District Department of Transportation based in Washington, D.C. And I've been in contact with you, Benito O, Pérez, before. You can wave to the audience as well. I will let you all introduce yourself when you start your presentation. And the setup here as will be similar to the one where we had a London session before, and helping us being both a critic and also an expert is Ivo Cree, who is I will see if you will have to have the opportunity to introduce yourself as well, but you are the director at Police for Policy and Projects, which Police, apart from just being a project partner in this review project, you're also as you say yourself, the go-to European network for urban mobility issues for European, local, and regional authorities. Okay, Washington, D.C., the floor is yours. And I don't know who of you are going to start present, but we already have the presentation up running. So go ahead.
Yes. Good afternoon. Oh, go ahead.
No, a reminder for everyone else of us who are presenting here to mute ourselves during when one person speaks. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon to everyone listening in, and for us here, if there's anybody, good morning here from Washington, D.C. Jason, next slide, please. My name is Benito Pérez. I'm the Curbside Management Operations Planning Manager here in the District Department of Transportation. I'm joined by my colleagues, Dave Lipscomb, our Curbside Management Planner, Joseph Kerwin, our Program Analyst and Operations Lead, and Jason Meggs, who is our Curbside Management Planner. We're also joined by our colleague, our Research Administrator, Stephanie Dock. She'll be joining us for the question and answer session of this presentation. Next slide, please. All right. So just to give folks a background on the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., as it's known around the world. We're the nation's capital here in the United States. But beyond that, we're actually, a vibrant city here with 700,000 residents and just as many commuters coming into the district on a regular basis pre-COVID, and another 125,000 tourists. So it gets pretty crowded here in the district during the middle of the work week. We're a little over 61 square miles here, and that's the land part. We're 68 square miles if you include the Potomac and the Anacostia River. We're also very multimodal. It's been a lot of work over the last 30, 40 years to get to this split of mode share with a third of folks taking transit, walking, biking, and also reducing our footprint on people taking the automobile. Next slide, please. Just to give you a history on curbside management in the district. This goes back for us to 1938 when the district recognized they needed to do something about curbside management with the Model T proliferating throughout the United States at the time. Oklahoma City, 1935, invented and installed the first parking meter. And for us was in November of 1938 in our what is now today considered our Penn Quarter Chinatown neighborhood. For the most part, the policy in curbside management dealt with personal vehicle storage up until around 2000. And that's when things started to change, when people realized we needed to think differently about our transportation system. So in the last decade, we've been diversifying our uses to focus more on the movement of people and goods. And that can range from picking up, dropping off, micromobility, and facilitating more access to the curb for our transit providers. Next slide, please. So the curve has been evolving over time. So as I mentioned, up until 2000, Jason, you're going to have to click through slowly through here. Up until 2000 was storing the curb, vehicles and trucks, and the occasional bike. But once we got into around 2010, we introduced bike share, food trucks, ride share like Uber, Lyft, and Via here in the district. From there, it was point-to-point car sharing in 2012. And then it was on-demand delivery. So that was Uber Eats, Grubhub, Postmates. Then around 2017, we introduced dockless bike share and scooters. No longer did they have to go into a station. They could float around on our public space. And in 2019 was our mopeds. So that's our Revel. Again, that's our like point-to-point car sharing, but now in the moped space. So next slide, please. So our team is the Parking Ground Transportation Division here at the District Department of Transportation. Historically, again, it's been focused on vehicle storage, but we have been recalibrating, rethinking our brand and what we do. We're talking about changing our name even to Curbside Management. But historically, we think about parking, and that's from the policy and the operations aspect. But now we're moving more into the space about curbside access and really honing in on what it means to provide access to the curb for people and goods. And not generically, but also looking at specific nuances, whether, persons with mobility challenges, the short access to the curb with uses like Uber Eats versus, the needs of like UPS. Then also there's access to the curb for mobile vending. How do we facilitate that fairly and equitably? As well as providing support towards multimodal transportation access. Next slide, please. So in 2014, we did a curbside management study. That was the first effort. There's been efforts before, but it was looking at nuances about parking. But this was the first effort in 2014 to let's look at the system holistically. Who are we? Where have we come from? And where do we want to go from here? The moral of that story from that study was, we have a system that we're trying to bring together. It was very fractured and very, we're trying to fit a lot of things into one box and realizing everything does not work in one box. We have vibrant, unique neighborhoods with unique demands and challenges. So we had to recalibrate our thought process to be more context sensitive, at the same time holistic, because what may happen in one neighborhood is going to be different from another. But at the same time, there's still going to be synergies between the neighborhoods. So we have to think context sensitive to the neighborhood, but then how's that impact its neighbors and then the district as a whole. Next slide, please. So as once we think about things holistically and also context sensitive, we think about how we're going to program our curb and how we facilitate the safe and efficient movement of our transportation system. So when it comes to the curb, we're talking, either rush hour restrictions, and more recently, and for the last 12 years, is our performance parking zones. And what I mean by that is our initial incarnation of it was just setting a zone-based pricing. In 2014-15 is when we started to do time of day pricing. 2018, in our stadium area, we started doing progressive duration pricing. And as we go towards the future, trying to leverage technology opportunities and data to be more responsive to demand to ensure that access to the curb, again, for people and goods. And we started playing with that also in 2019 with a vendor curb flow on how we facilitate that just-in-time access to the curb, the monetization value of the curb. And then from the lessons, we'll hope to eventually apply it to not only our loading zones, but these pickup and drop-off zones that we've created in 2017 to help facilitate that just-in-time access for like Uber, Lyft, Grubhub, Postmates, etc. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague David, which will actually delve a little more about those examples like that dynamic curb management, what we've been doing now and where we hope to go from here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Benito. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about dynamic curbside management. I'm going to talk specifically about the development of our pickup drop-off or Pluto Zones. This pilot program originated out of a need to address a nightlife district where we had free and cheap parking, and thus we had basically 100% occupancy most of the time. So then when those businesses started getting more active in the evening, it was very difficult for people to get dropped off safely at the curb. We worked with local stakeholders there to basically clear out the curb and make that area specific for pickup and drop off so that we could easily facilitate that. With success of that program, we expanded it to other areas of the district where we were seeing similar types of activity, or maybe even all-day activity, where we were seeing rideshare activity being high, on-demand delivery, services like Uber Eats, Grubhub, those sorts of things. And so we recognize that the metered parking wasn't necessarily the most productive use of that curbside. So we wanted to create a very simple and easy regulation that we could enforce. We recognized we had to increase the fine because in many of these areas it might cost as much as $30 or $35 to park in a commercial lot. So we wanted to make sure there was added incentive to keep people away from that zone for other purposes. There is some short-term commercial loading allowed, but we don't really want to undercut our paid commercial loading program. But again, we found this to be helpful because it allows for a variety of different users who really just need short-term access to be able to safely get that. Next slide, please. So what we're seeing here is a map of our Pluto zones. So the red stars that you see there are the zones that were established under our pilot program, and we did research on where we thought those would best be placed. We have additional zones in planning. But looking at the green and yellow stars that you see there, those are essentially stakeholder requested temporary emergency Pluto zones, and this was a program that we established as we started going into lockdown during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we wanted to ensure that the restaurants that were then prohibited from having any dine-in operations were able to easily handle the spike in on-demand delivery orders as all of these services were looking to accommodate people who were trying to get something to eat and also support these businesses. So we have about 150 of those zones now. We have about 26 regular Pluto zones operating, and we're actively collecting data right now to understand where there might be areas where we want to keep these pickup drop-off operations permanently to support areas where we have a lot of restaurants that are experiencing that activity. And so I think this program is emblematic of us trying to be responsive to changing conditions in the district and recognizing that our traditional curbside programming might not be what we need. Next slide, please. So we'll revisit these at the end, but we want to talk about a couple of challenges related to this. So one of the big things is the regulatory challenges. And the issue that we have here is, again, historically, we've been programming the curbsides for vehicle storage, but now we have all sorts of different operations, particularly commercial operations that are trying to access that same curbside space. And so as you can see in this graphic here, traditionally our commercial loading activity would look like maybe 15 to 16 minutes with a large box truck or something like that. But now we see with, again, the on-demand delivery services, rideshare, and things like that, I may have just an ordinary sedan, a regular personal vehicle that's being used in a commercial capacity. And right now, we don't have the regulatory framework that exactly supports that, and recognizing that there is some cost recovery that we need to do to ensure that we are getting the most out of our curbsides. Additionally, enforcement is a bit difficult. Without having someone essentially monitoring every zone 24 hours a day, we're not going to catch every violator. And we want to make sure that we have a rich enforcement culture so people understand how these zones are supposed to be used. Next slide, please. Another one of our big challenges is incorporating accessible designs. Looking at this issue, particularly in older cities, sometimes we have very dense urban environments where we don't always have space to accommodate what the modern design standard calls for. Additionally, we are trying to incorporate a lot of different types of programming as well as road designs. And as you can see in the photo on the left, we have somebody using a Metro Access van, and they're being let out into the bike lane, which conflicts with the rider there. That's our own Joe Kerwin, who will be presenting a little bit later. But we use this to illustrate that we have to be mindful of everybody who is using our roadways and our public space, and we have to be proactive in creating designs that work for everyone. And I say it all of the time, and I'll say it repeatedly, not just because it's the law, but because it's the right thing to do. And we want to ensure that we are promoting equity throughout the district for all of our users. Next slide. So with that, I will turn it over to Joe Kerwin to talk about our shared mobility programs.
Thanks, David. I'm actually wearing the exact same shirt that I was wearing in that photo. It's the diversity of my wardrobe. Yeah, so I'm Joe Kerwin. I'm an analyst in the Parking and Ground Transportation Division in DDOT with these guys and on Benito's team, and I serve as the operations lead for the on-street shared mobility program. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thanks, Jason. Yeah, so essentially we have two shared mobility programs sort of that DDOT manages. The on-street program, which exists, basically on the curb in the parking lane, falls under our division, and then we have what I would call like an on-sidewalk program, which is dockless scooters and bicycles and e-bikes and docked bikes as well. So I'm going to be talking about our on-street program, which consists of point-to-point car sharing, which is sometimes called free-floating car sharing, and then reserved space car sharing and moped sharing as well. And these vehicles are all plated and tagged, and they have to operate in a travel lane. We manage these programs with public space permits that have related terms that we have various requirements to operate in the district in those terms. We do charge for the use of the public space, so I think we've historically have structured these charges around sort of the cost of using, say, like the average cost of a meter across the year or something similar to that, as well as bringing in our residential permit parking fees into the fee. But we have recently sort of reevaluated that and tried to position our fees in a way that is a little bit, I think, more encouraging to the shared mobility industry and less prioritizing less of recovery of costs, but still positioning fees in a way that makes sense. And we don't really have an application fee process or anything. It's just, if you meet our requirements, you're in. If we could go to the next slide, please, Jason. Yeah, so I'm going to go through briefly what we have in public space. So we have a point-to-point car sharing program, which is you pick the vehicle up at one place in public space at one space and drop it off in another. Sometimes it's called free floating or one-way car sharing. We have one incumbent operator, free to move car sharing, which has around 600 vehicles in the district and also serves a neighboring district, Arlington, Virginia. Yeah, unfortunately, we've lost. I don't know, say we've lost, but we've had two operators pull out of the district market in the past 12 months. Car2Go, Share Now, and then Penske Dash, which launched in the district and then pulled out earlier this year. If we could go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so the second mode that falls under this program is reserved space car sharing. It's basically two-way or round trip car sharing. They have around our one incumbent Zipcar, which is also our longest tenured provider. I think it's almost 20 years at this point. Has around 550 vehicles within their program, and only about 70 on street, which is the program that we manage, and their other vehicles are off space or off street rather. If we could go to the next slide, please. Yeah, this is our third and newest mode, moped sharing, which is newer to the United States and new to the district. It's basically similar to a point-to-point service, point-to-point car sharing service, where you pick it up in one place and drop it off in another. We define, I know these vehicles are sort of defined differently in different jurisdictions. Essentially, in the district, they're defined as they are defined as motor vehicles, so they have to be tagged by the DMV, and they are positioned within the DMV's classification system between electric bikes and motorcycles. So electric bikes don't have to have a tag, and these are sort of the first tier of vehicles that do have to have a tag, and they can only operate up to 30 miles an hour, and after that is a motorcycle, which you would need a motorcycle class license to operate. Yes, this program is in pilot right now, so we launched it in the summer of last year, and we're still sort of analyzing it and learning about it as our residents also learn about it. Next slide, please. Yeah, so these are basically our high-level goals for the program. Essentially, I think the number 1 and 2 things that we want out of the program is a more efficient utilization of the district's curbside, which leads to a decrease in parking congestion, and then a reduction of greenhouse gases as the service is fairly green in and of itself. And generally, we want to get people out of cars and offer equitable access, and make sure that the district itself is collecting the data that we need to effectively manage the program. Next slide, please. I think we missed one. Jason, do you think you could go back 2 slides? I see the sustainability slide right here. Oh, here. Okay, here we go. Yeah, so data sharing is a huge component of this. Obviously, we focus on sort of goal-based data requests. We don't like asking for information that we can't use. I can go more into that if there's interest, but generally we're in alignment with, or we want to be in alignment with the Open Mobility Foundation, which manages the mobility data standards for shared mobility, and I think we're not there yet, but moving toward that for shared mobility. Next slide, please. Yeah, so high level, we have a focus on equity in the program. We want to ensure that the operators are serving the entirety of the district, and sort of distributed around the district properly. And you can see through these 3 graphics, the left is the district boundaries, and then the next 2 are current free-floating operators service areas. Next slide, please. Yeah, obviously sustainability is a huge component of this. We have a couple requirements in there that we like to focus on, including, the car sharing vehicles have to be, rated tier 3, a tier 3 vehicle by the EPA, and then they have to be registered with the district DMV, which has more stringent emissions testing than surrounding jurisdictions. And more recently, with our moped program, all the vehicles have to be electric. Next slide, please. Yeah, so going in a little bit of the challenges here, a big portion of this program is curbside allocation. We want to, I think that we think that these programs reduce parking congestions, sort of, and desaturate the curb, which is supports our other initiatives and efforts. A lot of it is determining how and where we designate the spaces for these vehicles. So point-to-point services are fairly easy. We just let them operate in safe zones. We let them park in safe zones, and they have to avoid, say, we have rush hour lanes in the district. So at no point that switch between a travel lane and a parking lane, depending on if it's rush hour or not. So we've recently had to make the decision that at no point can any shared mobility vehicle be parked in a rush hour lane, because we can't ensure that it's turned over in time for the rush hour hours to start. And we've also been thinking about, should we even be designating public space for some of these services, as we see some, the challenges that we have with reserve space car sharing, which I'll go into in a second, versus point-to-point car sharing. And some of those challenges with reserve space car sharing is really just that we have a dynamic curb now, and we have an ever-changing curb, and we have construction we have to deal with. So reserving a space for car sharing and putting up signs and putting up markings and stuff, while it has some benefits, ends up being a lot of admin work, both for us and for the car sharing company. So we want to think about how we encourage, more point-to-point and more dynamic services. Yeah, this is a big one. Obviously, safety is a major concern of ours and a major focus for us, especially with the new moped sharing services coming into the district. It's the reality that people aren't very used to the mode, and so we get a lot of new users who are riding a moped for the first time when they get on a shared moped in the district. So we have had a major focus on sort of what we can do to educate users, how we can communicate the importance of wearing a helmet, how we can monitor helmet usage within the program, and that's been a lot of what I have worked on this summer, I think, for the moped sharing company. Yeah, and we see a fair amount of market volatility for the especially for the point-to-point car sharing system, point-to-point car sharing market in the district. So I think that we have to sort of create an adaptable program on our end, which has been a synchronization between the operations team and the policy team. I think has really created that within the district, and then thinking sort of what we can do as we see two point-to-point car sharing operators leave the market in the past 12 months. Just thinking about what the district can do to how we structure our permit and structure our requirements to still encourage car sharing in the district, but still leave some room, I think, to incentivize the behavior that we want to see through our fee structure. Yeah, and this is a big one too. Messaging around the shared mobility program. It's essentially what Benito was talking about earlier, how we're moving from car storage to a dynamic curb, and we want to we have to bring our residents with us. I think to some extent, people see these vehicles as a little bit of a nuisance, or have in the past, and we mainly just want to highlight the benefits of these vehicles. Thank you. That's it.
Okay, let's see. Are you anyone in? Okay, there's an echo there. Okay, so you're not finished.
I guess I'll.
Yes, apologies. We're going to pick up the pace here. So Jason, David, please speed up, please. Thank you.
No worries on my end.
I was waiting for Joe to hand it off to me. So I'll be talking about how we're dealing with. Can you hear me? Can anyone hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can.
So I'll be talking about the situation at urban schools. It's another dynamic evolution here in DC. The public school system began actually in the 1860s. They were designed as neighborhood schools, walkable. Obviously, we didn't have cars, let alone all of these other new modes and modalities. But Congress passed an act in 1996, and in 1999, everything opened up to where there could be new independent charter schools, and students began to travel across the region, across the district, to get to their school. And it was actually estimated that there was a 20% increase in peak traffic just over time because of this change. So it is a very significant impact on the whole transportation system. And of course, DC is growing in many ways, and we also have private schools. So there's now about 322 schools for kindergarten through 12th grade, elementary school, middle school, and high school. And all of this has also put pressure on staff. And obviously, it's an essential service. It's a priority to facilitate staff arriving at school. But the challenges there are we have increasing population. In the last 14 years or so, we've had about 10,000 more a year, going up to over 700,000 now. So that's quite significant. Obviously, a lot of increased curbside demand in general. Housing costs has increased quite a bit. Commute lengths have increased. Distance to school for students as well as teachers has increased. There's school modernization programs where more capacity is needed on schools, new facilities. So there's infill development on school grounds, which were already limited. And neighbors are seeing the impacts of these changes. So they have a mechanism by which they can restrict the access to neighborhood streets. So it's permit only or 2 hour if you don't have a permit. And teachers complain of low salaries. It's the #1 reason for leaving their jobs. Then all this implies that we have more cars, more students, more schools, less curb space. Half of teachers are now living outside of the district. So obviously that means a lot more of them are car commuters, and that means they're trying to park at or near the schools. More students are therefore driving as well, especially high school students have cars, and that's impacting residential streets. The infill, the school modernization, is meaning you have to choose between, say, a parking lot and a playground. Playgrounds usually, but don't always win. So that further constrains staff parking. Neighbors are tightening the supply, and about over a quarter of teachers are quitting each year. So there's high teacher turnover, which really impacts the quality of education and the morale of students, and obviously the teachers. So we have a lot of curbs conflicts as schools lose parking, and parking around the school is constrained. They're sounding the alarm. Staff are turning to on-street parking and going for the 2 hour zones, parking all day, getting a lot of citations. You can see this little snapshot from November 2019, where about 2/3 of schools were within 500 meters, or sorry, 2/3 of parking citations, violations that were cited are within about 500 meters of a school, or roughly 1/3 of a mile or more. And obviously the residents as well as local businesses and other institutions have a stake, and all of this needs to be balanced somehow. And so we're actually turning to analysis. We have a curbside policy and planning process for schools. As we develop this, we hope to also apply it to other essential services such as emergency services, fire, and police. So there's an act currently going through the regulatory process, the Daytime School Parking Act, which would formalize requests for school curb designations. Right now, there's a lot of alarms sounding everywhere. We want to kind of be regular, calm it down, have an organized approach. Each school is encouraged to, and it will be considered whether they actually have a transportation demand or TDM management plan and a TDM coordinator for the school, who's a point person, to make sure that the alternatives to parking are fully explored and enjoyed. So anytime there will be a request under that act, we'll have 60 days to turn around a decision. And that's another reason to really get an organized, formalized process. Looking out to the world, is there an existing methodology for this type of problem? There's very sparse literature on how to deal with urban schools that we've found. And if anyone has a resource, we would love to see it. So one approach that we're trying, we have a pilot project to provide staff a hidden parking zone so that they would actually use the Park Mobile app to register that their vehicle is in the area, and then enforcement would identify that electronically by plate recognition. For a particular school, we expect it to be on trial by late this year, early 2021, so really a few months. That's been in process for over a year. And then the long-term vision is to see if we can roll that out when we have digital institutional permits, perhaps by early 2022. And the school could help manage that through the principal. So just to quickly summarize the challenges that we have here, there's a lot of data that we're looking at to try to really see if we can fairly balance all of these issues, as well as the potential for TDM, for actually moving some of that parking demand to other modes. We're looking at the capacities on the school and all around the school. We're looking at the actual travel patterns. Where do people live? Where are they going? Not just for the school, but for others in the area. What is the viability of mode shift? There's a lot of political sensitivities around these issues. Schools are essential services. Neighborhoods are very powerful. Businesses need to be able to have customers reach them. So there are a lot of competing needs. And I'll just mention, part of the difficulty here is there's so many structural causes that lead to this type of issue. There's geographic inequities. Part of the reason people are traveling all the way across the city, perhaps even more than an hour commute for some folks, is because of the existing geographic inequities, trying to avoid race, poverty, looking for the best school they can find. A lot of different personal reasons people have. Housing costs, obviously, it's essentially skyrocketed in the district. So more and more people are living further and further out, even 2 or 3 hour driving commutes for some teachers. Teacher salaries are far below median salaries, and that creates also the incentive to live further away or to leave the schools, turnover. And our whole public transportation system is focused on getting to downtown, but the schools are spread out all over the district, 322 schools, pretty much everywhere except for a few pockets. And for other alternatives such as bicycle commuting, there's all the traditional barriers of the lack of infrastructure, and the culture has come a long way here in the district, but it's not a universal mode at this point. I'll turn it back over to David with the next section, communicating.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about some of the work that we've done on sign redesign. So what is the problem? We're 2 weeks out from Halloween. I'm about to show you some very scary pictures. So brace yourself. Next slide, please. Try not to be too horrified with what you see. I don't even know that I need to explain this slide, but looking at these signs, we recognize they're hard to read, they're hard to understand, they often have conflicting information, and that's not very good for the driver who's got a very limited amount of time to kind of figure out whether or not they can be in that space at the curbside. Next slide, please. I don't know if we're stuck. Can I get the next slide, please? Okay. We have here in the pictured what we call Christmas tree poles, because it's red and green and there's a million different things dangling off of it. We have all of these different signs, and again, we have the same issue. I've got to try to decipher all of this as I'm trying to quickly figure out where I can park my car or not park my vehicle. Next slide, please. Communication barrier. One of the things that we recognize, we're a very diverse city, and not everybody is necessarily proficient in English. So when we have only signs that use, or signs that only use language, we may be missing folks in their ability to comprehend what the regulation is actually saying. Next slide, please. We recognize that we can make simple adjustments to add graphical elements that are much more recognizable and easier to understand and interpret quickly, and that's helped guide our sign redesign efforts. Next slide, please. So we're moving to more graphic representations. We have a couple of examples of signs that we've changed here so that we can make things more efficient at the curbside with bus zones. Everybody's looking for a piece of the curb, and we have to reserve that space for the buses, and that's something that's quick and easy to interpret. And I'll mention that we use our public transportation logo there because we are a city of tour buses. Everybody comes to visit us, and we got to make sure that we don't have just any old bus parking there. It's a Metro bus, but again, it's something that's quick and easy to understand. Next slide, please. This is an example of our tour bus meter zone that we introduced the last couple of years when we started doing on-street bus zone parking. Again, we wanted to make this very visible. Our bus drivers are using very large vehicles, and we want to make sure they're operating safely. So we have to have signage that's easy for them to recognize, and they have very limited areas where they can actually use. So the quicker they can identify that, the better. Next slide, please. Pickup drop-off zone program, which I mentioned earlier. Again, very simple, international, no P for no parking, but instructional and informational language in yellow and black, letting people know what is allowed there. Next slide, please. Looking at our accessible parking spaces, in the earlier photo, you could see one of our zones. We have some special regulations around accessible parking. So we want to make sure that we are using images and actually we use the blue color here from the MUTCD Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices to again denote this is a special space with a special restriction, and we have some special provisions for how much time accessible spaces are allowed to get, all indicated there. Next slide, please. And simplifying our pay to park signs. I think you may have seen some other examples where we have all sorts of times and regulations. We really want to simplify that. And as we move to parking kiosks that are programmable dynamically and remotely, we can put all of the information about how long you're allowed to park and the dates and times and things like that. This is especially helpful in our stadium event zone where we have baseball games and soccer games that go throughout the year, and we have to dynamically change those restrictions depending on what day it is and what events may be going on. So we're guiding people to the asset where they can get that information. Next slide, please. So we're looking at sign consolidation, taking our Christmas tree signs and shrinking them down to really the most minimal information that's necessary to convey what these restrictions are, and putting a little bit more onus on people to get information either from our on-street assets or mobile apps if they're using that to pay. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at the challenges, sign clutter is always the big one. Linguistic diversity, right? Making sure that everybody can just understand what they're actually seeing, and reducing distractions to drivers so they're not holding up traffic as they're trying to figure out where they can go. Next slide, please. And I believe that concludes our presentation. Something we say all the time is curbside management. It's more like a marathon. It's not a sprint. This is something that is ongoing. We have to iterate all of the time. And it really just takes a collaborative effort and consistent management of what's happening at our curbs to find the best programming and respond to the conditions. So I think at this point, we'll take questions and move to the discussion about our challenges. Thank you all. I'll turn that over to Benito.
All right. Thank you, everybody. So open it up to the group.
Yeah, thank you very much, the whole team. One question that comes up in my head is that earlier today we had a presentation of what barriers we have identified as potential challenges for cities, and one of them is staffing. like human resources, and here you are. There are 6 of you here from the DOT. 5 of you are working directly on the curbside management or related policy issues. And I know that you have a new plan, a new transportation plan coming up, finalizing next year. I mean, I expect this to happen like from the beginning, but can you tell us a bit about how can you get all these resources for working with this, and can you see that there's a development over time that you get increased resources for staffing?
All right. I could have added that, but as you see, we had a lot to discuss. But on the workforce, we actually did a presentation earlier this year at the Transportation Research Board on this topic, and we're happy to share our work in that space. But at a high level, there's some concerns of, we are a staff right now about 20 to 25. And we have a diverse population from, our newest staff member, actually Jason's our newest staff member on the team, to some of our veterans who are, 30 years young at the agency, or spending 30 years of service at the agency. So we have a wealth of information and history and also bringing in new perspectives, but it is a challenge considering that I would say 50 to 60% of our staff is at that retirement point. So we're about to lose a lot of institutional knowledge. And that's why in the last few years, we've been trying to capture that institutional knowledge and also identify where there's been gaps and challenges from historical precedent, and how do we start to evolve that to today, and also recalibrate some of these positions to be more adaptable and more collaborative. So historically, we were talking about this is about vehicle storage. So that was just getting, an engineering technician to go out in the field, look at the safety and the function of the curb to store vehicles. Now we're talking, how do we become more efficient with less? How do we optimize what we have? Because we're not building, we don't own, or do we have capacity to build parking garages here in the district? We actually don't own any public garages, they're all private. So we have to look at it as, how do we use data to be efficient? So now we're thinking outside the box, bringing data scientists, computer science, also maybe bringing on folks that are familiar with behavioral science. How do people think? So that using all those pieces together to rethink how we use the curve outside the box. So to answer your question, it is going to be a challenge, but as we think about the staff that's retiring, think of also, how do we reimagine our workforce and bringing on new talent with these diverse perspectives to further energize our team.
And this might be a question for you as well, Eva. I mean, have you seen a similar approach in any European city as what you've been?
No, and that's also one of my questions. I am very much impressed and also intrigued by the fact that you have an institutional anchoring of this notion of curbside management. Your function titles include it. Your part of the organization has not only the mandate to work on this, but also the name to work on this. And I'm wondering how that came about. Is it a top-down decision or a bottom-up decision that people notice, like, yeah, we are actually working on much more than what is parking, and or is it a couple of strategic thinkers that suddenly say, hey guys, parking people, you should work on other things too? So I really wonder if it was an incremental process or really a decision that has been made at strategic level, pushing it downwards, saying, okay, let's now make the shift. Because in Europe, it's mainly at the moment, it's at the level of pilots. And it's also really, if you look at organizational or what we call institutional settings in cities, it's really a tough, it's not a fight, but it's looking for the best solutions to to work from very strong and well organized and very competent parking agencies, working with other street management functions, and it's not always easy. So if you can explain a bit how that has worked the past 10 years or longer, that would be really interesting. Yep.
Okay, so in that space, I think how to start. So let me first start with the institutional context of the district. So we're also kind of the envy of our colleagues here in the United States or other cities, because with a lot of other cities, they are in essence creatures of the state. So, San Francisco has to respond to Sacramento, or New York City to Albany. We are both a city and a state for the functions of our peers. So we derive our authority from our city council, which actually acts also as the state legislature. So, and we're also the city, but also state DOT. So we have a little more flexibility that a lot of our colleagues do not have, which allows us to pilot things a little more quickly because there's no additional layer. The only hiccup that could happen is any of these initiatives has to still be vetted by the US Congress. We still have that part of our Home Rule Act. They usually do not interfere. The only thing that they have put the brakes on in the last few years is congestion pricing. So we're envious of Stockholm, that one, because it's seen as a tax on our peers in the suburban Maryland and Virginia. But going deeper into the question, so that's the ground floor. First, we have that environment to work in. Secondly, I would say, when we did the curbside management study in 2014, that was kind of the first wake-up call. That study actually started as a residential permit parking study. That's where it started. It was supposed to be, we have a residential parking problem, we need to fix it. And, discussions, myself and some colleagues that were there at the time. So it was kind of a low to mid-level part of the agency kind of saying, it's more than just residential parking, because if we do this, it's going to impact meters. If that's going to impact businesses. And we're like, wait, this is more holistic. And, that's, well, for us, at least at DDOT, that's when we started coining the term curbside management. It was still nascent at the time. And actually, I was in the policy office at the time. And eventually, the agency recognized we need to build this practice a little more because it's more than just storing vehicles. We were, there was around 2015, there was efforts for Vision Zero. We were trying to become a Vision Zero city. We're thinking more investments in bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, more transit, priority infrastructure. So they're like, well, we need to fix this parking issue. And that's when we started really building up the curbside management practice. And in 2017, we formed the Parking Ground Transportation Division. Only now, actually, the conversation with DDOT leadership is like, wait, you all are doing a lot more than just parking and ground transportation. You are actually doing management of the curb. So we are actually revisiting our actual name of our division now to eventually become the Curbside Management Division, because it's more than parking. Our emphasis, our priority now is about moving people and goods safely and effectively. And the mayor, Muriel Bowser, in 2016, if I recall, was the first time she made a statement saying vehicle storage is the bottom of the list. We need to focus on all the other priorities of the curb. So that was the first time hearing it from the top. So working to refine, the district's vision on what curbside management is going to look like. In San Francisco, well, actually, I'm not going to preempt their statement, so I'll let them explain that part. But
Okay, yeah.
a specific priority that they've set, and we've at least set the priority that vehicle storage is at the bottom, but we're still working on refining what the rest of that priority is going to look like. And right now, we're working with that holistic, context-sensitive approach.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Per, I can continue with a couple of questions. It's okay. Yeah. So I really like the fact that there's a strategic view on these issues. What I am missing in the strategic approach is the issue of money, of budget, of revenue. I've watched carefully the presentation, and for instance, in the slide about the objectives of the policies, revenue is not mentioned. Maybe it's because you say, okay, this is another, this is not the place to talk about money. We're talking about policies. But is there anyhow a link with a financial target or a revenue target in your activities, being a positive target like getting money, but also a negative target, saying like not losing too much money by replacing paid parking by other functions that are currently not being paid by the user? Yeah, is it an issue for your unit at all, this revenue question? Because we notice in the European discussion that, of course, the idea that going beyond peak car or peak parking also means that you see the revenue loss happen. That is a problem for cities.
I'll touch upon it at a high level and then let Joe talk about from the shared mobility side and David from the like the Pluto, like that the challenges there and implications with the load zones. So at a high level, up until 2016, when there were bike lanes being installed from the parking team, we're like, well, you're taking out a parking meter, so how are we going to recoup that meter space, that revenue? Because any revenue that's generated from the parking meter is directed since 2014 to our regional transportation authority. It's part of the district's contribution, and the meter revenue as of 2019, because I'm not going to count 2020 because it was an interesting year. Our fiscal year just ended. But for 2019, we generated about 53 to 54 US million dollars in revenue from our parking meters, from about 20,000 meter spaces. And that constitutes about 10% of our contribution to our regional transportation authority. So of course, we're a little sensitive when you lose parking spaces, but at the same time, the mayor made it a thing in 2016, like this is not a priority anymore. The priority is safety and officially moving our mobility. So we've moved away from that. We're trying to rethink other opportunities to recapture value of the curb, expanding performance pricing, doing more dynamic pricing, because at the end of the day, as it was proven in San Francisco, and again, I don't want to take some of their thunder, but it was proven when you use price, if you don't make revenue a priority, it'll come regardless, as long as you use the pricing tool to better manage the curb. And we've been doing it in Quarter Chinatown. We've ended up, I think, generating, and I don't know if Stephanie's still on, about 20-30% more than previous years when we were not doing performance pricing in Penn Quarter Chinatown. Again, our priority there was not let's do more revenue, and for us, it's a concern of ensuring that we don't want to be seen as a revenue grabber. We're just trying to manage the curb, and that's what keeps our public content with what we're doing. Because if it's all about the money, they're not going to cooperate with us here. Because there's some folks sensitive here. We have a unique demographic disparity. You have folks in Northwest Washington. They're like, residential parking permits should be $2,000 a year, and you have folks on the east side of the city that says residential parking at $35 a year is too expensive. So for us, it's not about a revenue generating opportunity, though it is a concern, but it is not the primary driver. Our primary driver is managing our curb, and if we do that, the revenue will show up regardless. I don't know, Stephanie, if you have anything else about that before I turn it over to the others. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, then I'll sorry. Yes, please.
I just wanted to piggyback on what you were saying about managing the curb, and I think that's the direction that we're looking in, particularly with our pickup drop-off zones, because we recognize that the activity is there, at least the demand for the activity is there, and so we're creating that space to facilitate that access, and it was primarily done to address a safety concern. Since then, we have started to evolve and conceptualize, okay, what is more productive on that curbside? Is it somebody sitting there paying $2.30 for an hour, and they're probably going to stay 2 hours, and maybe they'll get a ticket, maybe they won't? Or, on a bustling strip, does it make more sense to have that space open because I have 100 or 200 Uber Eats orders that are coming to pick up. I have people getting picked up or dropped off by Uber or Lyft or Via or one of those services, or just, we use the funny example of grandma coming to pick you up from the club, so you don't have to, drive home drunk, right? We're trying to understand what that value is, and how do we capture it. And it's something I think has been circulating within the field for a while, but we don't really have a great way to necessarily compute that. And I think one of the things that we're seeing from the pandemic response is a heightened awareness about public space and how it's used and what is the highest and best use of that. And I think we are hoping for the best, and we're hoping for a quick recovery, but we recognize we will see a very distinct change in how businesses are performing and other things are performing. And so we are hoping that we can use that to get a better picture of what a strip of curbside is actually worth, and what really generates the proper cost recovery, what mechanism is going to generate the proper cost recovery. So that's something that we're looking at, and I think we will start to see that around the country as well, as we look to figure out how do we recover from this, and how do we future-proof our curbs so that no matter what happens next, we are prepared to be nimble in our response.
Yeah, I recognize that from Europe also, that the curbside use during the lockdown, what we call the lockdown, was also, the management was different. Cities also stopped with the enforcement of parking, or with paid parking. And that also has created some kind of a mental shift, that authorities, but also citizens, understand that whatever management applies to the curbside is dependent on the context, and can be changed over time. So I think that's important. Pet, I have two more questions, and then we can also look at the chat. I keep an eye on the chat, but I don't see anything happen there.
Before you continue, you brought up a point about enforcement, and that has been a challenge right now. A lot of our peers did shut down parking enforcement during the various stages of lockdown here in the United States. I'm not going to lie, what's going on here. But a lot of cities have restored their parking enforcement. The district has not. The district, New Orleans, and Atlanta are the remaining U.S. cities who have not restored enforcement. And it's starting to be noticed by the public that they're circumventing, parking regulations. So it's something that's percolating up to leadership, that they need to revisit that sooner than later, before we lose any semblance of order on curb management here in the district.
I will ask my most critical question now, and then my less critical question at the end. As a rhetorical, I not to end in a bad mood if my question would fall badly. The part that I found the most let's say out of my comfort zone was the part about the school, the school zones. I'm sorry, Jason, but for me it looked a lot like saying like, if we have a hammer, so every solution is the nail. Now say that my solution is a hammer, so every problem looks like a nail, or whatever you say that. But the idea that you are now equipped to work on curbside management, so you approach the schools with that solution. And I understand, of course, that there is a much bigger transport demand management, what we call mobility management approach for all these schools, and that you present here the specific focus of what happens in the immediate surroundings of the school's curbside, school gate, and the infrastructure surrounding that. But is it the best entry point, or isn't there shouldn't you be a secondary player in this, and isn't there a more holistic problem that shouldn't be starting from this solution to be solved?
So let me start.
I hope I don't upset anybody with that question.
Oh, no. It's
Yeah.
a valid question, and actually, and I'll start and I'll let Jason build off of it. I strategically put that in there because for a lot of folks, or schools are all over the district, in commercial areas, residential areas. So it's going to touch the most number of residents when we start talking about the issue around schools. Everyone can relate in some way, shape, or form to the school from those residents have a stake in the conversation. At the same time, introducing the concept also at the school gate also brings some exposure to even the students. I think that's when they first start to see these things and they start to remember, you know, it's probably easier. It was easier when I was going to school to walk or bike to school and then create that culture and take that with them when they grow on to, you know, employment, school, university, whatever else they do from there. So really, you know, the conversation on curbside management, it's important that it starts at the school. So they see it out there. You know, one thing maybe that we may need to improve upon is actually bring that conversation into the school in a comprehensible method. You know, in earlier practice in my career, there was the concept of box city, where we, you know, kids built cereal boxes in, you know, a little playground like roads, and then they were given like Monopoly money. It's like, okay, there's a lot of traffic. Where are you going to invest your $20 of Monopoly money? You know, figuring out maybe that's, you know, the next step for us. And another challenge is educating not only the public, but even our future stakeholders on the concept of management, but bring it to the school, connects it to our future stakeholder, but also our current stakeholders. Everyone's going to see this. So Jason, I don't know if you have anything else to add. I guess not. All right.
No. Okay. Yeah, my last question has to do with two elements that are somehow related. I'm also impressed of the scale, of course. I mean, if we look at European cities, we have pilots, we have small scale dynamic use use applications of the curbside, but you talk about 150 bays or 150 locations for one application, for instance, and you've mentioned very high numbers. That is somehow related with the operational capacity you can lever from your unit, and I would like to understand a bit how the actual street management and enforcement works, and for instance also the if there's a private component to that, or if there's if it's all public servants doing all the work, and whether the actual let's say the front office people, the people who go in the street to equip the sites or to enforce the sites, etc., if they are ready for these new concepts, and if they are, what has happened to get them up to speed with the innovation that you are implementing. So the element of scale, and also if you could recommend something to European cities on whether it's smarter to pilot or to go big at once, that could be interesting to understand. But also this element of your unit, 25 people, how do they put the machine in motion that then actually brings this to the street?
Okay, so we're not like other cities. So we have the team of 25 at Parking Ground Transportation. We're supported on like the meter side through a private vendor since the late 90s, and that stemmed from the devolution of a meter team that we did have. That because the district did go was under a financial control board in the late 90s, and that was one of the recommendations to privatize that function. So that still happens today, though it removes some semblance of control, so it's not for everybody. And so what's the best value, and be able to be more responsive. Parking enforcement is not within the District Department of Transportation, unlike other cities. It's actually with the Department of Public Works. DDOT itself actually has been around for 18 years, roughly. It devolved from DPW in 2002. So still some minor functions still with DPW, and there's a lot of coordination that has to happen with them. And when we introduced a lot of these concepts, it had to do a lot, they were overwhelmed. You know, you're introducing more bike lanes, transit lanes, streetcar, and then with that, a lot of signage, and they were just getting confused. So a lot of our efforts now, not only at the public education, but it's also been sign simplification and getting down to brass tacks. Is it to facilitate people access or goods access? And do they have to pay or not pay? And opportunities, you know, we're looking eventually to move to pay by plate, so we can start facilitating progressive duration pricing, so we can get rid of time limits. So then from the perspective of the parking enforcement officer, they can just walk down the street. Is it the right use? And are they paid? That's it, and move on. Because otherwise, if you're working time limits, so you know what kind of payment, blah, 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 it gets way too complex and they get overwhelmed. So for us, that's why we've been spending a lot of efforts, not on the education of the public, but simplifying our signage and simplifying our technology so it's straight to the point. We also have been trying to collaborate more with our peers across the region, because we don't live on an island. When we raised our meter rates in 2016, our neighbor, the small town of Tacoma Park, Maryland, had just adjusted their meter rates from $1 to $1.50, and on the district side, it was 75 cents. After that time, price change, it went from 75 cents to $2.30. So you can imagine what happened to the parking demand, and they were pretty upset about that. So as we start to do a lot of these changes, we've been now working more collaboratively with our regional partners, especially those that border the district. So one, it's not a surprise to them, and second, they can adjust their operations and also bring forth a more a team effort and share our own resources together. So I like to tell the group, like, resourcing our thing, like if we're going to Costco, also getting pricing and savings and being able to share that together across the region. For example, we had a meter solicitation that actually just closed on Tuesday, and the aim there eventually is going to be a regional contract, much akin to what our peers in Boston did a few years back, and hoping to make this more of a regional approach. And I imagine with our European peers, you know, you have, I'll pick on London, like you have the city of London, but I'm sure there's also adjacent jurisdictions too. And how do we work together as a region? Because if you think about just John or Jane Q Public, they may live in the district, but they may want to go to a play in Bethesda and have dinner in Arlington. That's 3 different jurisdictions. But as the customer, the consumer, they don't care what border they're crossing.
And if I could add one thing, Benito, to build on your discussion about collaboration within the region and look internally as well, I think we have done a really good job in the last couple of years of articulating what our priorities are to other divisions in DDOT, and we have, you know, done this continual education, and you know, we typically work with you know, a lot of different divisions to you know, ensure that our curbside programming is in line with whatever new project is being installed. But one thing that's been great, and this has really been a big thing with our micromobility team, is that they start finding things for us. So when they're looking at curbsides and looking at places and where they can do in-street micromobility corrals where you can store your bike or scooter, they say, hey, you know, this is a pretty busy area, and we kind of have some strange programming here. Maybe this is suitable for a Pluto zone, or maybe we can sort of create a division between our pickup drop-off zone and our commercial loading zone, using, again, some sort of micromobility infrastructure so that we get that separation. You know, our public space division, which you know, handles development review, you know, they have learned a lot about what we do now, and so whether I'm at the meeting or not, they have a general idea of the things that we're looking for, or they alert us to special situations where we may end up having a conflict and we have to go in and do something special. So that internal collaboration has really boosted what we're able to do, because we're not the only eyes on the street. We have nearly the whole of DDOT kind of looking through our lens.
And also the general public too. So we've been looking at opportunities with data and information, or at least setting up the framework to empower our public. And I give the example of our Georgetown, DC neighborhood, where, prior to 2014, they were like, you need to do this, residential only parking. And there was no clear distinction of what the problem was. So we've recalibrated that process to start asking communities, first of all, what is the problem? And they quick jump to like, I want solution X, Y, like, that's not the problem. What is the problem? So we can have a better understanding. Is that problem holistic enough? Have we thought about it from all the angles? There, DDA, with our capability through the eyes and ears and the technology, is to collaborate on data points to either support or refute it. But we're not going to be determining that. We're just like, here's the data points that we have found. We have our own opinion, but we're not going to drive it. We want to empower and inform our citizens and let them have the discussion. And when we met up with Georgetown again in 2015-16, they were having a lively, very lively debate, but they were using the data points that the DDoS staff, we just sat back and just let them run the show. And some person was like, we should have the solution. And someone checked them and said, no, this data point says it's not Maryland, Virginia drivers coming into this part of the neighborhood. So stop blaming them. Here's the point. We need to revisit this towards more dynamic management at our curb versus making it all resident only. So we empower the citizens, and we've been working through that throughout the rest of the district to ensure, through open data, through, information with our upcoming Park DC website, so people know what we're doing, what tools are out there, and then let them drive the conversation, and for us to be really facilitators of the curb.
Yeah, I can only, for that purpose, we have a lot of experience in Europe also, because there's so much licensed by ANPR, license plate based enforcement, and it gives such good information also that can also support that kind of discussions. Per, I saw that Jason wants to be unmuted, and apparently that's has to be solved.
I just have to apologize. There was some kind of glitch where I was muted and I couldn't speak when I was asked, and it was a war between the buttons. But I don't have anything to say immediately unless you have a question.
Okay. Good. I have a lot of questions, but I don't know if there are. I don't see all functionality, so
let's bring in some of the questions from our let's bring in some of the questions from our participants, attendees, and there's like both questions and reflections, and both fitting into the discussion about the schools. I mean, I think I interpreted you that you also do a lot of other stuff regarding school and school traffic, and we got a comment about the examples from London about creating school exclusion zones, limiting traffic, and that. I think it's an interesting note. We got also a question about you mentioned a bit about that you are both functioning as a city and a state at the same time, and that then you have like remove one layer of legislation. Is there for you, like on your district level or on a national level, a cap on the maximum parking fee that you can set in your city?
That's a local jurisdiction. Well, I guess it depends on where in the country, but here in the district, it's set by the DC Council. So our both local/state legislature. And other cities around the country, it depends on what authority the state granted the city. So for some cities, so they're like, you know it best, you do it, you handle it, let it to the local council. And for others, they are tight controlled, and the state controls what they can or cannot do. So the examples I have are from San Francisco, but I'm trying not to steal their thunder.
Okay. Well, I think it was David who mentioned, who showed us the example of jumping the fines when introducing Pluto zones. Is that a politically sensitive question doing that?
I think what we're trying to, historically, we're fighting an uphill battle, to ensure that we're not we're revenue grab. So a lot of this has been trying through data, through practice to show our decision makers like there could be some automated data controls to help inform the decision. So one thing that we recently had was performance pricing. We had an $8 per hour cap, like we couldn't go above that. I think right now it's being debated before the DC Council to get rid of that cap permanently with specific data checkpoints to justify. It can't be just, oh, we're going to raise the rate. We have to justify objectively through data, and council is going to start going outside the box and give us some leeway. It's not a guarantee right now because it's still being deliberated by the council. And that may, that's going to be their first foray in the performance pricing space. And depending on how that goes, that might give us a little more latitude in other spaces, whether it's the generic meter rate across the district or eventually parking fines. And we do have some latitude right now to make recommendations in performance parking zones to adjust fines higher. But still, we have to right now currently bid it to council, not right now internally. Eventually trying to get that flexibility so that we do our due notice to the public, and of course justify through data to meet the requirements of this proposed regulation. So our hope is in the future, maybe in the next 5-10 years, we may have a little more latitude than where we're at now, but we're definitely steps ahead from where we were 10 years ago with that level of latitude.
I see. Going over to the presentation of you, Joe, there was in my head at least, I mean, for European cities, or maybe it was you, David, introducing private companies or allocating space for shared mobility solutions, or maybe companies. Is that a sensitive question in regards of privatization? Do you end up with that critique sometimes?
Yeah, I think to some extent we get resident and other stakeholder feedback like that, like why are you allowing these companies to come in and make $1 off of the districts, using the district's public space? And yeah, historically I think our response to that has been that we charge them a high fee to come here and operate in the district, and which a lot of time alleviates the concern, but we've sort of transitioned from that talking point more to just discussing or trying to highlight sort of the benefits of the program. And a lot of the concern around seeing these new vehicles in public space that people don't recognize or haven't seen before, or aren't familiar with the service, is that they're coming in and they're sort of taking up parking spaces that should be allocated to private citizens in residential spots, especially. So I think we know that these cars actually reduce parking congestion, and that they're used by, instead of one person, 8 to 10 people, depending on sort of the vehicle and the location. So we try to highlight that, and I think the line I mainly use, and I think I send it in every single email I send to service requests for car sharing issues, is that these vehicles are actually increasing public parking availability in your neighborhood, and that if you see that vehicle in public space, it's your neighbor that's using it, and that neighbor is more likely to either not own a private vehicle at all, or not buy a second private vehicle.
Okay, I
we've
see.
tried to highlight.
So taking it a higher level real quick, it's succinctly just balancing, recapturing that value of the curb access against the public good. So you look, for example, because we also have mobile vending, so food trucks, also commercializing the use of the curb. And you have restaurants complaining about, well, we pay taxes, brick and mortar, this, that, and the other, and these food trucks just get to park and make a quick buck. Well, we are also recapturing that value of that curb. And then the rest of the conversation with them is like, that's a business practice between you all and the food truck to, better compete with each other. We've done our part to capture, try to balance, the value of that curb access. After that, that's between, retail economics and marketing. We're staying out of that conversation. But it's balancing access, value of the curb, because you're infringing on the public access, and balance that against the public good. So car sharing has a public good, so we're not going to penalize them, considerably than we would say a food truck, or the direction the mayor has stipulated about private vehicle storage.
Well, when introducing shared mobilities, operators are giving them, allocating them space. Do you also include some sort of cost-benefit analysis or I don't know, return of investment when saying, okay, we should allocate this space for this function instead of parking?
That is a conversation we're having now that we are wanting to explore a little more. And, you know, I could imagine in the near future also probably bringing on an economist, maybe if we can bring an economist on board. We also have a Curbside Analyst program, interns, and David is an alumni of that, where we have that opportunity to bring on, you know, new talent in those spaces. We've had an environmental engineer, we've had an economist, we've had a sociologist come in and ask various questions that, you know, we're interested in, and also build the use case to our leadership that, you know, we should have some of these disciplines more full time in our division. So that's how we've gotten, we, you know, bring in a finance person here soon to look on finance side of the equation of our division, to be able to look at forecasting and, you know, start to maybe scratch at the surface about what that value of the curb is and some of those questions you were just asking, cost benefit analysis.
Yeah, I think that fits your holistic approach. Also, when introducing this shared mobility, do you do any kind of marketing surveying the needs of the end users, or you just see that this measure fits our higher goal, let's incentivize it?
Can I pipe up from the kind of broader policy? Like,
go for it.
The research program kind of supports our broader innovation efforts. And so I work with all of these folks, but I'm not actually in Curbside. But we've been really working on beefing up the process by which we evaluate the pilots that come into our agency, particularly when they are emerging technologies, and looking at more strategically identifying which are good, you know, kind of technologies to bring in, and how to do that assessment after the fact, with a bit more structure to all of that around it. So it's a work in progress, but I'll say that particularly with the dockless mobility, there was a major evaluation effort that was done following the first year of implementation of that program. We partnered with several universities who accessed the data, conducted surveys, and really tried to give us a good solid look at different aspects of whether that program was working. And so I don't remember specifically how much was focused on the curbside, but the bigger question of essentially, should this be something we allow in our public space and continue to use, you know, offer to the, you know, make available to the public, was a key question that was being asked. And the lessons learned from that program have iterated our permit process. And I'll say that's one of the interesting ways about how we bring this in, is that because it originally was a pilot and then became part of a permitting process, we can revisit the structure of that permit on a periodic basis, which is what Joe deals with on the car share program as well, and all of these efforts. So we're not taking it as a single fixed approach of like yes or no, we'll keep it this way, but rather, you know, let's take a look at how the program's been doing. What are we hearing from the operators? What are we hearing from the public? And trying to make sure that we are asking those questions.
I see.
Marketing surveys that we do, and Joe, I don't know if you want to succinctly talk about some of the feedback we get on an annual basis from our vendors.
Yeah, we make the programs basically available for public comment every year. So it's not like, from a DDOT perspective, it's not so much direct outreach to the public, but it's an opportunity for feedback, which we then integrate into the next year's sort of terms and conditions and sort of our long-term thinking about how the program is going. And, you know, we also track and integrate all the customer service calls we get for the program, which, you know, we work with our call center on.
And there's that surveying aspect of it too, about have you gotten rid of a car and started using car sharing more? So there's also some demographic survey questions in that same annual survey to vendors that are, to our customers, that our car sharing operators have to do to their customer base.
Okay, I see. Well, folks, our time is up. This has been truly very interesting, and I'm also, as Eva said, impressed of all your efforts and all your projects. And I will hopefully have the opportunity to come back with you with what we write in our report, and maybe more questions as well. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you everyone for listening in.